Rescue. Search and Rescue is one of the foundational texts of the Creepypasta series, like I said. It's written by Kerry Hammond. It's actually been very loosely adapted for TV. There was a 4-season show called Channel Zero, which adapted famous pieces of Creepypasta, and Search and Rescue formed the basis for, I believe it was called Butcher's Block, the 3rd season. Now, this is good because there's some really good stuff in there, and it's bad because, unfortunately, it means that Hammond couldn't pursue a full detailed novel of this stuff. However, given that we proceeded through all the stuff that was available at the time, late last year, I find it very interesting that there is now more search and rescue fiction. And what we're going to do
We'll just take this as happy coincidence.
Yes. What we're going to do this week, and probably next week as well, is walk you through the remaining pieces of it. The basic premise is this. The main character is a search and rescue officer in America's national parks. And the stories themselves are about his very slow realization that he has been trained to ignore things which he should not have been trained to ignore. And that the occasional but persistent horrific deaths he witnesses are very far from natural. I serve you fair warning, as has just come up in the content warning.
Yeah, we need to talk about the content warnings for these stories, because these get grim, folks.
Yeah. Swearing, body horror, descriptions of corpses, and the death of children are all very commonplace in these pieces. And that's why we have shenanigans. Seriously, the 3rd act of each one of these shows is always a couple of pieces of TMA-related shenanigans to lift the mood a little bit. And please don't think this is us coddling you in any way. This is us coddling me. I, despite having been the host of a horror podcast for over a decade now, oh shit, it's over a decade.
I know, honey, you keep realizing it's been over a decade, and it's the best job you've ever had.
Oh my god. Anyway, despite that being my primary gig right now, I am startlingly credulous when it comes to this stuff. This is why I am not allowed to go to magic shows by myself. I'm not allowed to go to hypnotism shows at all.
Oh, Kato. Oh, Kato. Bust you, troll. All right, chat. For those of you who don't understand why Alistair is laughing hysterically and on the edge of mania at the morning, we have been podcasters since 2005. Serial was released in 2014, which is when people seem to think podcasts were invented. And every couple of weeks, every month or so, some cheeky fuckwit comes up with an article.
Content warning, American swearing.
Yeah. Really? Okay.
Yeah.
You did that so fast I couldn't put in the baseline. Nicely done. We'll come up with, but since the inception of podcasting, it's Serial. And Alistair and I will post specific room gifts of each other that say, reset the clock! Yes. And then we will try to lower our blood pressure and go swiftly back on. So...
If you've ever seen Chasing Amy, then there's a very particular scene about halfway through it. It's a scene which includes Jason Lee standing up and, in his best banal white man voice ever, yelling, "But isn't that true?" Yeah.
Okay.
I feel that. Anyway, let's move on. Oh, podcasting. Kato, sir, don't worry at all. That was very, very, very funny. I just that tickled me exactly the way I needed.
Thank you so much for the comment, Wendy. Yes, I don't slur my profanity. I enunciate them clearly like a fucking lady.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. We are watching.
So much. Love her.
We are watching The History of Swearing, starring Nicolas Cage, and it is glorious on Netflix. I totally recommend it. Anyway.
Hey folks, it is, it's only like 20 minutes at a time, and it's so freaking good. So
hello, new folks who have just joined us. We are just
Kid Spooky,
about to start...
I believe Kid has stepped across from TikTok.
Fantastic. We are just about to start Search and Rescue, so I'm going to remind everybody again that these stories are dark, and they involve death and bodily injury and descriptions of corpses and usually dead children. So if this subject matter doesn't work for you, by all means step away, or if you need to have a cuddly object or person or pet to hand, That is perfectly acceptable.
Not to undercut any of the seriousness of that, but Wendy has just said, I love you so much, Marguerite. Ditch Misty Captain Birdseye and come do crimes with me.
Wendy, when have I only ever done one thing at once? I can multitask.
And
also, I totally have to buy you one of those ugly yellow rain slickers at some
I would
point.
totally wear that.
Full on Captain Fish stick,
Okay, so here we go.
Oh yes, probably also content warning. Accents. Enjoy.
I promise nothing. Raw manuscript material, part 1. Are you scared easily? That's what my trainer asked me on my first day. I said no, of course not, or I wouldn't be working in the middle of the woods. Apparently that wasn't the right answer, because my trainer just shook his head and asked me again. Are you scared easily? I thought about it, and then said I supposed it depended on what there was to be scared of out here. If we were referring to bears, yes, I was easily scared of a raging animal that's 3 times my size. If we were referring to the nameless threat of monsters and ghosts in the dead of night, and there he stopped me. I guess I'd given him the answer he wanted. He gestured for me to follow, and we started a hike around the main trail of the park. As we walked, we'd stop periodically and point to something. A big tree. 2 years ago, we found a kid lying under this tree, frozen to death during a blizzard. Wandered off, circled back here before we could get to him. We walked a bit further, then took a dog leg off the path to the right until we reached a steep bluff. He pointed. Down there, body of a mother and a newborn. Don't know how they got there. My guess is she wanted to breastfeed. Didn't want to do it on the main path. A mile further, we stopped at a rocky cliff face. He pointed up. Kid disappeared right there where you're standing. We found his body halfway up that cliff a month later. We searched there at least 4 times. Don't know how we got there. We walked for at least 5 miles into the woods. There were so many stories and so many stops that I lost count. I wasn't sure what point he was trying to make. I just nodded, followed along. At the deepest part of the trail, where a very clear marker had been placed to advise that the trail ended, he kept going into the trees. I stepped over obstacles with great care. He knew the area by heart. I asked him where we were going, but he just kept going without looking to see if I was keeping up. I'm not sure how far we walked. Probably a half mile or so when I saw something ahead of us. Through the trees, I could barely make out the right angles of it, and if there's one thing even the least savvy person knows, it's that nature does not make right angles. My trainer led us right to it, but the closer we got, the more unsure his steps became. He stumbled, actually, for the first time since we'd gone off the path, and I got the sense that he was taking us here only because some sense of duty demanded he do it. We came to the clearing where the angled thing was, and as we broke the tree line, I stopped in my tracks, and I just stared. I thought it was a practical joke. I looked at him, but he was staring off to the side, facing away from me. We were quiet, looking at it. It was a staircase. A perfect, brand new staircase. It looked as if it had come from one of the prefabbed development houses you see everywhere these days, to be honest. The carpet was off-white, and it even had a little landing at the bottom, and for a crazy second, I could feel a distinct sense of tilting, as if I couldn't quite deal with what I was seeing, and I remember thinking that was how people who went crazy must feel. As if they're falling, not quickly, but as if guided by something. I shook it off, but I was definitely shaken. I couldn't stand the way we just stood there, as if the stairs were some wild thing that demanded caution. I started to move forward, but my trainer threw his arm out and stopped me. He looked at the stairs, brows furrowed, and he said, very, very quietly, "They're everywhere out here. You'll see them just about every time we go out on a call. It's normal. He looked me in the eyes as he said that, driving home the point. I nodded and looked back at the stairs. I noticed there was no debris on them. No pine needles or animal shit or even dirt. A word popped into my head, and once it got there, I couldn't get rid of it, and that word was wrong. It would make a great story on those alien and Bigfoot websites, I thought. I could see the article, a big one on the front of those black and white magazines in grocery stores that scream about Bat Boy and the lady who married a Yeti. Stairs in the woods, what do they mean? When we get back to the centre, I'm going to give you a couple of forms and you're going to sign them, even if you don't want this job anymore. You're not going to talk about anything I've told you today. That goes especially for these. You're not going to talk about them. You're not going to take pictures of them. You're not going to go to any newsy type places and tell them how there's weird shit going on out here. You understand me? I nodded, a little perturbed. I'm going to give you a little word of advice, son. You're going to see them. You're going to see them everywhere. And they're never going to look the same, and that's fine. Maybe they're big, maybe they're small, maybe they're falling apart, and maybe they're like these and they are brand new. You probably won't ever see the same ones twice, but supposing you do, it's nothing to worry about. That being said, you are not going to go near them. This right here, this is as close as you are ever going to get. You're not going to touch them or ever go up them. And you sure as hell aren't going to go blabbing around to the visitors about how they might see them, because most of them won't. And if they do, you're just going to send them right to me. He stopped ahead and watched the stairs carefully for a moment. They're normal, son. They've been out here as long as I've been here, and that's a long damn time. We all know about them. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. I know you'll be asking around about them, and that's normal. But you probably won't have a lot of luck talking to anyone who's been here more than a year. And sooner or later, you'll get that way too, and that's assuming you stick around. You'll figure out that they're just something you got to deal with, and you'll find the urge to talk about them is less there, I guess. And then some rookie will come and ask you about it, and you'll just tell them exactly what I'm telling you, that they're normal, and that it is nothing to worry about. I didn't exactly believe him, but I just nodded again. There were too many questions to ask, but one seemed more urgent than the others. Why can't we touch them? I finally asked. What happens if we do? He cleared his throat and shifted. Son, all I can tell you is that a kid once asked me that about a rattlesnake with no venom. I was working for another park and we had it on display in the animal exhibit. Kid wants to know why we can't hold him. It's got no poison, right? I told the kid that just because that rattler's got no venom doesn't mean he can't bite. I opened the top of the rattler's tank and I provoked him a little. Snake hisses and lunges at me. Just about gets me. Kids all scream. I put the lid on the tank and some of the kids are crying. Little boy is staring at me and I say, "You still want to hold him?" He looks at me carefully. There's going to be a lot of things out here you're going to see that are going to make you curious. You're going to want to talk about them and figure them out. Go explore them and see what's what. But any time that happens, I want you to think about that rattler, son. Do you understand me? I nod. Now, I'm going to ask you again, Brower. Are you scared easily? I thought about it. I don't know, sir. He nods. That's the right answer. I've missed these.
You've apparently terrified the chat with a wink. And hello to Shitpost. They finished the
Shitpost
B
represent
story book today.
Finished the what, pardon me?
The B movie book.
Excellent.
Chat, I'm getting you a copy now to the A Christmas Carol collection because we finished those last week, Ozzy asked.
Right then. How's everybody doing?
A little more horror as a treat?
This one is marked simply SAR part ... which we're sure is nothing to worry about. This is my favourite time of year. It's not quite spring or winter, it's somewhere in between. It's too wet to camp, too dry to ski. People stay inside. I'm always grateful for that. I've had a lot of people express concern about outdoor sports. It's a fair question. Are we really safe out there? They want advice. How do they keep their loved ones safe? And I tell them I don't know. How do they avoid the stairs? I don't know. I really don't. And it's frustrating to have nothing to offer. If I knew how to keep everyone safe, I'd have solved arguably one of our biggest problems in this country. The only things I can stress are what anyone else does. Don't go alone, carry a GPS locator and phone, be prepared for anything. There's no pattern for this kind of thing, at least not one that I can see. There's commonalities, sure, but everyone's experience is different. This winter was quiet, mostly, but sometimes we're so overwhelmed it's all we can do to tread water. Here are some of the things I've dealt with in the past. A buddy of mine up at Crater Lake remembers the disappearance of a young man there about 20 years ago. Never found. This past winter he called me to ask for advice in a new, very similar case. Jack B., his wife, and 2 children were snowshoeing on a very, very well-marked trail. He was in the lead, the wife was behind. That's what we know. The wife said he crested a small hill. She lost sight of him for less than a second, and in that time he fell off the face of the earth. His tracks ended in the middle of the trail. There was nowhere for that man to go, and yet, in a literal blink of the eye, he was gone. They've been searching for him again now the snowpack is melting a bit. I'm sure they won't find him. There is something. That area is wrong. It's something about how the wind sounds. About 4 years ago, a new recruit, came to our park to do an internship with one of the senior rangers here. He was a really nice kid, actually. His name was Darren. I think he actually got really lucky, timing-wise. A lady had a diabetic crash, and we had to help get her out of a tricky area. And Darren was so hyped up about it. He was one of those guys, who's you just know he's going to do great. He's friendly. He loves the job. He's everything you look for in a ranger. But he had a problem with listening. Because Darren was a very devout Catholic who believed that the Lord would save him from any danger, and Darren didn't believe that what we'd seen was anything to be frightened of. The only parts of Darren that we found, 2 years after he vanished during a routine trail walk, were a 1/4-inch thick slice of his left thigh and the cap of his skull. Very early on in my career, I used to have a thing with kids who vanished. It broke me up really badly. I was always the first guy to volunteer. I couldn't stand the thought of another kid growing up alone with that kind of burden on them, that invisible second life. And I had a really good track record. I had this kind of sense that almost always led me in the right direction, so I started getting called out to other parks to help in SAR groups there. One of the ones I brought back was a little girl who was skiing up at a popular resort I was familiar with. I still remember her name, actually. It was Anna. Her dad, John H., was on ski patrol. I'd met him a few times, and he was wrecked by this whole thing. It was familiar. He'd been watching her ski down one of the easier slopes, following along behind. He lost sight of her for just a second, and poof, gone. I happened to be in the area during that time, so of course I went to help him out. By that point, she'd only been gone maybe half the day, so I was confident we'd be able to get her back by nightfall. We split up to cover more ground, and I went into an area that I know is full of really large boulders and cliff faces. Sometimes you find kids in places like that. It was unbelievably eerie that day. The sky was totally overcast, but smoke from a freak fire up north had turned everything a really strange orange colour, and it was dead quiet too, like the animals didn't know they should be awake or asleep. There was something about the light that made the shadows look wrong, like they weren't in the right places, probably a trick of the light, but disorienting as hell, and by pure luck I found her tucked into a tiny little crevice at the foot of a big boulder. I got her out, and it was almost like she'd been drugged. She was missing her shoes and coat, but she was warm, almost hot to the touch. I got her back down to the lodge safe, and they took her to be examined. There wasn't anything in her system. She hadn't been harmed. Oddly, though, she appeared to be suffering from severe dehydration. She'd lost almost 3 pounds. She'd only been gone a few hours. None of it made sense. It was so bizarre that everything got basically swept under the rug in favour of cheerful stories of her return. I reconnected with John a few weeks later to see how she was doing. The first night back, he said she woke up shrieking in the middle of the night and he couldn't comfort her. She kept saying that she didn't want to go back to the orange place. He got her to sleep, and by the next morning, not only did she have no memory of the dream, she had no memory of the event at all. He politely asked that I not call again. I obliged. I do think about her a lot, though. I wonder if she remembers now. My boss woke me up in the middle of the night one summer, and we had to run out to a campground at the edge of the park. He said a woman had called him absolutely frantic, insisting that there was some kind of large animal outside her tent. The cops were on their way, but I'd get there faster. Grabbed my personal gun, headed out to see what was going on. Now, she had set up camp in a pretty isolated area, so I had to park the truck and walk a ways out to her. And on the way there, this smell started to become noticeable, then almost suffocating. It was something primal, musky, angry. It set my teeth on edge, and I had my gun ready. Nothing in the forest was moving, so whatever it was predatory. We don't have bears up here, but that's not to say one couldn't have somehow wandered down from up north. As I got closer to her tent, I could see how badly this thing had torn up her camp. Her stove had been thrown up into the trees almost 20 feet. The fire had been stomped out, the coals scattered. One side of her tent was shoved in, and I could see the outline of her inside. I called out, and as I did, something on the other side of the tent moved. I froze, gun cocked, and in the weak light coming from her tent, all I could make out was a huge, bulky shape and 2 white pinpoints where no head should have been. She started to come out of her tent, and I told her to stop. The thing made a loud chuffing sound and suddenly seemed to dissolve and melt into the ground. I fired a round into the trees where it had been, but it was gone. I examined the ground, and the only slight trace of it was singeing of the dirt. It's not the first time I've seen that thing. It is the closest I've ever been or ever want to be. I saw it the first time outside of my house, in the middle of summer. It was very late, and I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about a little boy who'd gone missing. We hadn't found anything except one of his Power Rangers shoes. And I was at my back door staring out over my backyard, and I was exhausted and on the edge of passing out, but I felt guilty. I didn't deserve rest while that boy was out there. I was staring at nothing, and then something moved at the edge of the lawn, so I noticed and I focused in on my eyes. It looked like a very, very tall deer. I watched it closely. It didn't move. I couldn't tell if it could see me. I bent down to grab my binoculars for a better look, and when I looked up, it was pressed against the glass. It covered over 100 feet in less than 2 seconds, and it was all black, covered in disgusting, rotten-looking fur, and in the middle of its chest were two tiny white eyes. It looked right at me, and it wanted me to open the door. It wanted me to come closer. I broke away and ran to the bedroom and locked myself in the bathroom where there are no windows. I heard it tapping on the glass until the sun came up. Sometimes it asked me in my own voice to let it in. I didn't. Not that time, anyway. I'm sorry I haven't been around for so long. I had an accident. I had a pretty bad one. I'll talk about it some other time. There's been an outbreak here. It started about 3 weeks ago when the leaves were just turning. Tourists poured in from all over the country. It happens every year. To go camping before the first snow and take pictures. It's our town's last tourist season before everything shuts down for the winter, and we're used to handling the influx of people, but with that many people, of course, you're going to see a big increase in accidents and reports. A lot of the reports are the usuals: bear, Bigfoot, wildcat, serial killer. An equal amount of fires, gunshots, disorderly conduct, basic first aid. I cannot stress enough how mundane most of our days are in terms of unusual events. We can go months, sometimes years, without any really, really huge incidents. But that being said, we seem to be in the middle of an outbreak. In the last 3 weeks, we've had more unusual reports than we have in the past 8 months combined. Maybe it's because people are paying attention now. But isn't it equally possible that people are hysterical? Maybe they just want to see things because they've heard about them and want their own stories to tell. A lot of them are probably just that. This isn't. This is one of the ones that fit into the tiny percent of reports that we can't shelve, we can't dismiss as coincidence, because this one has physical evidence. I got a report about a possible body sighting, and I was dispatched to check it out. The callers were waiting out by the trailhead for me, a mom, her 2 daughters. One of the girls, the taller one, who I'll call MK, was talking about how she instantly recognized the bones as human, and made it clear that they hadn't disturbed anything at all. The shorter one, bright green haired, SK, was quiet. I asked her if she'd seen anything. She seemed visibly upset by the experience, and she did not say much. MK explained that they'd been out hiking to do some scouting. I didn't ask what she meant, so she continued, and clarified that they had been looking for anything unusual. Her mother broke in and assured me that they weren't looking for trouble. They'd heard stories about things going on in the woods and were simply using it as an excuse to get out and do a bit of hiking before winter. SK stayed close to her mother and only nodded in agreement at the appropriate points. At about the half-mile marker, MK pointed off the trail ahead of us. The bone stood out against the oranges and reds of the fallen leaves. Where it had fallen was very, very easy to spot. It was long, it was curved, it was completely clean of any flesh or muscle. A foot away, leading into the trees and away from the path, a slightly larger one, also clean, lay haphazardly on top of a fallen branch. We were careful to skirt around it as we passed. 4 more behind that led into the thicket they described, and tucked up under a bush was the torso. The mother backed away, and SK took her arm and held it tightly. MK knelt beside me and frowned. We inspected it together. Whoever he had been, he had not been toned. Bits of dead leaves and bark were stuck in the thatch of thick chest hair. After a brief survey of the area, we both felt certain the rest of the man wasn't nearby. Nothing had been disturbed. What we had was a segment beginning slightly below the armpits and ending just below the last rib. That's not all, though. Look. MK got to her feet and retrieved a small branch that she used to lift the flesh with. Doing this, we could peer inside the body cavity to see that it had been hollowed out. The remaining ribs rattled loosely, attached to nothing. The spine was gone. The wound was bloodless and surgical in precision. We inspected the edges, which were impossibly clean. There were no tool marks, no bruising, aside from the obvious. It wasn't clear what this man had died of. MK began offering her own theories, ranging from specialized equipment to some kind of cold laser, when behind us a small voice piped up. "Why are you lying?" MK turned the stick over in her hands before snapping it and throwing it away. I got to my feet and looked at SK. Her arms still locked around her mother's. They held each other tightly. "It was the stairs. That's why we're out here." SK lunged at the trees. "That's what this was, right? It's like the hand, that tree." Her eyes were watery and wide. "Isn't that what this was?" I could feel MK staring at the back of my head. "Let's go," I said. "We can't be here." SK's face tightened and she turned, leading her mother in a brisk walk back to the path. MK didn't follow. "That's it?" she called at me. "Aren't you calling it in?" "Let's go," I said again. I could hear her charge up the path and pass me with a furious glance. She passed her sister and mother and beat us back with time to spare. I walked them to the car, leading them carefully away from the station without letting them stop. Before they left, SK turned to me again. "I was right, wasn't I?" I didn't say anything. She looked at me for a little longer before climbing in the car. She watched me until they were too far for her to see anymore.